International. It was a playground for the wealthy until New Year's Day, 1959. Leading a small guerrilla force of fewer than 1,000 people, a lawyer and revolutionary named Fidel Castro seizes control of Cuba. He tells supporters, "I am not interested in power." Castro would soon steer his country toward communism. Out with private capital, in with Soviet aid. Cuba becomes a flashpoint for the Cold War. From the Bay of Pigs invasion to the Cuban Missile Crisis to U.S. economic sanctions, 9 American presidents wish Castro would disappear.
Cuba see, Castro no.
It was wishful thinking. The Soviet Union disappeared, Soviet aid disappeared, Castro remained. But Fidel Castro is an old man. Now, 40 years to the day after he seized power, we look at where Cuba is and where it may be headed after Castro is gone. Today, a special report. Castro's Cuba, the Revolution at 40, with Joey Chen and Jonathan Mann at the CNN Center in Atlanta.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. They were greeted on that New Year's Day as an army of optimism and ideals, guerrillas who overturned a hated regime and promised to bring justice to the people. Before long, they were known to the world by their first names, Che and, of course, Fidel.
40 years later, Cuba's communist government cannot feed its people, and its broken down economy depends on the currency of an enemy state to survive. In the next 30 minutes, a look at a revolution that has outlived its romance and is being judged by its results. And long after the U.S. tried to assassinate Cuba's leader and cripple his regime, a look at what Washington should do now.
We begin in Havana with CNN Bureau Chief Lucia Newman on what the Cuban people have to say about a revolution turned 40 and the changes underway today.
The remains of 10 leftist guerrillas who fought and died in Bolivia with revolutionary icon Che Guevara were brought this week to their final resting place in Santa Clara, Cuba. They were placed in the same mausoleum that holds the remains of Guevara, a solemn ceremony timed to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution that the legendary Guevara helped bring to victory. A small plane and a tank used by the rebel forces to overthrow the Batista dictatorship are proudly on display at the Museum of the Revolution. But today, it's a revolution very different from the one its founders envisaged. A revolution in which a lot which they fought for is disappearing, and much which they fought to abolish has reappeared. Until 1959, this posh mansion was known as the Biltmore Yacht and Country Club, the exclusive playground of Cuba's elite. The revolution closed it down, proclaiming that class privilege and discrimination were a thing of the past in the new Cuba, where everyone would be equal. Exactly 40 years later, it's been reopened in its reincarnation as the Havana Club, exclusive domain of Cuba's new privileged class, the expatriate community.
The club is designed for the diplomatic corps and foreign businessmen in Cuba. Cubans can come as guests or pay a cover charge if there's room.
At the Hotel Nacional, which is overflowing with tourists, Sergio Galvez delivers luggage. He gave up his profession as a hydraulic engineer to become a porter. A privilege, he says, because it allows him to earn tips in dollars.
This means prosperity for my family. Earning dollars gives me many possibilities. The benefits are greater because I can buy many things that Cubans who earn salaries in pesos cannot.
Indeed, Sergio, the porter, is part of the new Cuban elite, the privileged few that have access to hard currency in a country where the majority earn in local currency, but where almost every essential item is sold in dollars. Tourism, and with it prostitution and a relatively small but alarming percentage of drugs, are back. A doctor or a physicist, meanwhile, can barely survive on his or her salary. And the ration card, which used to guarantee that every Cuban had enough to eat, barely provides enough to feed a family for a week or two. All this is a sign of the times in a Cuba which has been forced to put aside some of its socialist economic principles in favor of mild market-oriented reforms. a bitter pill made necessary by the collapse of the Soviet bloc nearly a decade ago. 40 years after the revolution, Cuba still has a one-party state. There's still no free press. And open and public dissent are quickly crushed. But what appears to most bother ordinary Cubans are the economic and social inequalities which have arisen in their socialist country.
The worst thing is that a poor person like me can't go to the dollar stores. I work hard, but I can't go to the shopping center.
I would like things to change so that everyone had the same possibilities, that everyone would have the same rights to everything.
This music student says he's frustrated that he can't go to a discotheque. Like this one, because the cover charge is in dollars and costs more than an average worker's monthly salary. In today's Cuba, Cuban citizens are not allowed, even if they have the money, to rent a room whenever they want in the hotels, which are wide open to overseas tourists. All this is a necessary evil, argues the government, in order to finance and preserve the revolution's social programs, like free health and education.
It is true that now, because we were forced to introduce some elements of capitalism, inequality had reappeared in our country, but not to the extent that we had before, not to the extent that you have everywhere else.
The man who has led the revolution for the last 40 years continues, against all the odds, to insist that socialism is still valid, not only in Cuba, but elsewhere.
Nobody thought that one day the ideas of the French Revolution would be so widely expanded all over the world, so widespread in the world. Then why to believe that the ideas of socialism, which are so generous, which appeal so much to solidarity and fraternity among men, why to think that they're going to disappear?
Perhaps socialism won't disappear, but, like it or not, it's evolving in Cuba. At the moment, economically, and in the future, perhaps politically as well. Lucia Newman, CNN, Havana.
Joining us now to talk about the revolution at 40 is Carlos Fernandez de Cosillo. He is the head of the North American division of the Cuban Foreign Ministry in Havana. Thanks so much for being with us. There are two ways, at least two ways I can think of, to reflect on a revolution after 40 years. Let me ask you both. First, how different would Cuba be today if there had been no revolution?
It would have been a much different country. It is difficult after 40 years to try to explain what would have been the evolution of this country. Perhaps the world and the region would have evolved differently if it were not for the Cuban Revolution in many aspects relating to our country. So it's difficult to measure it. But when you look at the country we had before 1959, a country with a corrupt government, a very divisive political and economic situation, a minority of the people with all the wealth and foreign ownership of most of the wealth and the economic means in this country, I don't see any reason why this country would have evolved to a better place without a revolution.
Let me ask you about the second way that one could judge the work of the revolution after 40 years. How many Cubans today would leave the country, would leave the revolution behind if they could, to start again somewhere else?
Well, that's a very difficult question. What I can tell you is that 11 million people live in this country with the Cuban Revolution. After 40 years, in spite of the hostility that this country has had from day one of the revolution, the majority of the people still support our revolutionary process. It's a process that has been successful and has gone beyond its initial commitments in many ways, in spite of the fact that it's been not only 40 years of revolution, but 40 years of hostility coming from the greatest power in this world. And in spite of that, the majority of the people still support this revolution.
I ask you because, of course, as you know, more than 100,000 people left in 1980, thousands more left in 1994. Many of them, I'm sure, wondering if the revolution's goal of freedom and economic prosperity really have not been met.
Well, our country, it's placed geographically beside the United States. a country that attracts most of the migrants in this world. If you would give the opportunity to migrate to the United States, to the rest of the region, I'm sure you'd get numbers similar as the ones you get from Cuba, or perhaps greater. So the fact that Cuba is still a third world country, the fact that it suffers from strong political and economic hostility coming from the United States, and influences in some ways the fact that some people want to go and live in a wealthier society, in an industrialized country, in a country that perhaps to their minds will give them greater opportunity for well-being.
Carlos Fernandez de Cosillo, thanks so much for this.
You're welcome.
For those who have fled Castro's Cuba, now may be a pivotal moment. Some find a sense of change in the air within the exile community and in the homeland. Here's CNN Miami Bureau Chief John Zarella on that.
Isabel Ramirez left Cuba when she was 10. She hasn't seen her relatives in a quarter century.
Just to be able to see them and hold them and be part of them and just let them know that, that we care for them here.
Like the others on this charter flight to Havana, Ramirez is carrying everything from gifts to medicines for her family. Not long ago, flights like this didn't exist. But the times are changing. When the Pope visited Cuba last January, he brought a message of reconciliation. In 1997, Jorge Mascanosa, the powerful leader of the anti-Castro Cuban-American National Foundation, died. And in recent years, more moderate Cuban Americans are forming organizations and speaking words that at one time were heresy.
We have to go beyond the embargo and beyond all these policies. The issue here is this is a struggle of the Cuban people. We need not intervention, we need solidarity.
With Cuba cutting deals with everyone but U.S. companies, many American businesses are pressuring Washington over opportunities lost to an embargo that hasn't shaken Fidel Castro from power.
Foreign investors are making strides in the Cuban market and are really making serious investments. And that's in real estate, in agriculture, in medicine, and in many other areas. That is having a serious impact on the way Washington hears the question.
Washington also hears the hardliners. Even without Mascanosa, the Cuban-American National Foundation has enough congressional support to block legislation it deems soft on Castro. And it constantly reminds Washington of what it calls Castro's inhumanity. The 1994 Rafters crisis, the shoot-down by Cuba of the Brothers to the Rescue planes, and the 1980 Mariel boat lift. And its leaders are warning U.S. businesses that companies investing in Cuba now are in effect using slave labor. And when Castro goes, they'll pay.
They are using slavery in order for their own enrichment, and they have to pay for that. And they will have to leave the country, no question about that. And that is something that the American businessman should learn.
Ileana Ross-Lehtinen is a U.S. Congresswoman. She is also a Cuban exile who will not soften her stand on Castro and says talk that the community is getting soft is nonsense.
We're still as hardline in our beliefs that we want to do everything we can to help bring democracy, freedom, and justice to the enslaved people of Cuba.
For those who were born in Cuba, like Ross-Lehtinen, and then exiled, it is easier to remain hardline.
We came here with a round-trip ticket on Pan Am because we thought this revolution was going to last days, and the days turned into weeks, weeks to months, and the months to years, and now decades.
But if you cut to the chase, one thing is crystal clear. Cuban Americans may differ on how to change Cuba, but they all agree Cuba must change. And Miami's Cuban community has changed too, simply because so many years have passed. They have built businesses here. They have seen their children grow up and have children here. Many are now more Miami than they are Havana. John Zarella, CNN, Miami.
When our look at the Cuban Revolution at 40 continues, from dictator to revolutionary hero to Cold War enemy, U.S. policy on Fidel Castro's Cuba since the revolution.
On the passage of time, the Cold War is now long ended. Still, the divide between Washington and Havana shows little sign of closing, and among U.S. leaders, a gap over the Cuba question remains as well. Correspondent Jonathan Aiken now from Washington.
Cold War strategy and domestic political considerations have meant the United States has played a tough hand against Cuba in the 40 years since Fidel Castro came to power.
There was a time when there were revolutionary groups that were Cuban-inspired and in some cases Cuban-supported in countries all over this hemisphere.
That era of revolution has ended, and the Cold War is over. Yet U.S. policy towards Cuba remains a contentious issue.
U.S. policy towards Cuba is obsolete and counterproductive. Counterproductive because it doesn't advance U.S. interest in Cuba.
Our policy has actually been very consistent for the past 40 years towards the Cuban government, and that is to promote a respect for human rights in Cuba and a democratic transition.
The result of this test of political wills is the one constant in U.S.-Cuban relations. Washington's policy towards Havana is never quite what it seems to be.
As the Cold War ended, the U.S. laid down a series of markers to Cuba. Remove troops from Africa, stop exporting revolution in the Western Hemisphere, reduce ties with the Soviets, then relations will improve.
All those things by 1992 had been done. But what did the United States do? We tightened the embargo with the Cuban Democracy Act of that year, and then in 1996 went to the most draconian legislation yet against Cuba, the Helms-Burton Act. So we did exactly the opposite of what we had told the Cubans we would do.
Helms-Burton lets U.S. citizens sue firms that invest in or profit from U.S. properties in Cuba, properties nationalized by Castro in 1960. It also prevents the officers and shareholders of any company doing business with Cuba from entering the United States. Helms-Burton was designed to isolate Cuba. Critics say it's isolated the U.S. instead. Neighbors and allies have threatened trade actions, prompting President Clinton to repeatedly suspend some provisions of the law. Supporters say, and Havana admits, that Helms-Burton has damaged Cuba's fragile economy.
Denying hard currency, denying economic assistance and or trade with Castro has caused him to do various things that he would not have done other than because of the necessity we have created. For example, he has reduced the third largest army in all of the Western Hemisphere.
Critics say Helms-Burton has more to do with the political sway of Cuban exile groups who support the 36-year-old embargo the U.S. has imposed. Times have forced Fidel Castro to change. He's welcomed the Pope, the U.S. dollar, and greater foreign investment. But time hasn't shortened the arm's length with which Havana and Washington deal with each other, or settled the arguments any U.S. policy towards Cuba are bound to generate. Jonathan Aiken for CNN, Washington.
On what else has not changed, the passion on both sides of the U.S.-Cuba divide. Those who take the strongest positions often have some personal connection to the island and to its leaders, as do our guests today. Joining us from Albany, New York, Representative Charles Rangel, and with us from Miami, Representative Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. We appreciate you both being with us. Ms. Ros-Lehtinen, if I can begin with you, talk about the personal connections here, and you do, of course, have a very personal one. You and your family left when you were a very young child, before the time of the revolution itself, I understand. But looking at it now, I mean, after all, a lot of things change when we reach middle age. Could it not be time, perhaps, to reconsider?
Well, sadly, what has not changed in Fidel Castro's rule of Cuba is that we still do not have free elections. We still do not have respect for human rights. We always have a one-party state. There are no other political parties but the Communist Party.
But the United States has
accepted dissidents, so
but the United States has accepted so many other countries, so many regimes in which there is brutality, in which the standards, maybe for cultural differences, are different, and we accept that in our relations with other countries. Why is the condition of Cuba different?
I don't think that we should ever understand and say, gee, it's okay, it's just another type of ice cream that people are having when you have a totalitarian police state where anyone who differs from the state party is rounded up, prosecuted with trumped-up charges, and actually they just, so hopefully what Castro wants is for them to disintegrate in jail. I don't think that the United States should give up its philosophy as being the beacon of hope and really the refuge for the oppressed, and I think that we should continue to isolate governments that are not adhering to a democratic rule of law.
Right.
We have had successful embargoes in Haiti and South Africa.
Let's bring in Mr. Rangel here.
International solidarity.
Let's let Mr. Rangel speak on this point that we talk about the beacon of light. Ms. Ross-Leighton has just referred to the United States as a beacon of light in its relations with many countries. We accept relations with China and Vietnam, countries that we have had great differences with in the past. You have visited Cuba. Your personal relationship was 5 hours of conversation with Mr. Castro. What do you see as different, and why do you see this as a moment for change?
I'm afraid that this policy that the United States have had in recent years with Cuba is not because of the politics of Havana, but because of the politics of Miami. There is no question that presidents in the past have not had the political courage to open up trade and to challenge the Cuban government by allowing the free market system, allowing tourists and business people to show the difference between an American country and a communist country. As you pointed out, that's what we're driving to do in communist China, in North Vietnam, and in North Korea. But because of the emotional feelings that Cuban Americans have in Miami, because of the votes there in presidential elections, we have not found in the past either Republican or Democrat presidents willing to have the courage to stand up to a sound foreign and a sound trade policy with Cuba.
All right,
I hope that President Clinton has the guts to do it before he leaves office.
But Charlie, you've got to understand, and you know better than anyone else, that all of the foreign investment that you are lauding there, when they go to Fidel Castro's Cuba, all of those dollars go into Castro's pocket. Let's remember that Fidel Castro is one of the world's richest men, while Cuba remains one of the poorest countries of our hemisphere. All of those dollars go into Castro's coffers. They don't flow to the Cuban people. Even Lucille Newman's piece correctly pointed out that these Cuban nationals cannot even enter those hotels and enjoy all of the luxuries. So foreign investments, after 40 years of pumping all of those dollars into Castro's pockets, the Cuban people are no freer today than they were in 1959.
Mr. Rangel.
We don't have Americans pumping those dollars. Everybody else is investing except us. What I'm saying is that we should bring competition into Cuba, and that will bring about the change. Bring in the reporters, bring in television, and treat them as we do other nations. To deny them food and medicine is one of the most painful experiences that, as an American, that I've had to go through.
A last moment here, Ms. Leighton. Do you see an opportunity for things to change as long as Mr. Castro remains the president of Cuba? After all, he's the man who said that revolutionaries don't retire.
All we have to do is take him at his word and at his deed. He's the very first one who says that he will not change. Socialism or death. All of these countries have been wheeling and dealing with him, and people in Cuba are no longer, are not allowed to have freedom, democracy, and justice. And that's not because of the U.S. embargo. That's because of Castro's failed policies. He's the one who's denying those basic necessities to the Cuban people, not the United States policy.
Mr. Rangel,
well, after Castro, then who? Who follows Castro? And you have to admit that the poor after the revolution really got a better shake in terms of education, in terms of opportunity than they ever got, and they still had the United States with this unlawful, unconstitutional embargo.
We are going to have to leave it there. We appreciate both of you being with us, Charles Rangel, Ileana Ross-Leighton, and thank you for your comments.
Before the revolution, Cuba was ruled by Spanish colonizers and then by its own corrupt elite. Cuban history didn't begin with Fidel Castro, and it won't end with him either, which raises the question of who and what kind of government would eventually take his place. CNN's Havana Bureau Chief Lucia Newman looks at the options.
Death by the CIA.
President Fidel Castro has been talking about death a lot over the last year.
And I have never been afraid of death. And I have never been concerned about death. I have learned not to feel attached to positions. And not to feel attached for that which is called power.
Whether attached to power or not, the man who has exercised it uninterruptedly for the past 4 decades knows that sooner rather than later, the laws of nature will force him to give it up. What happens next to Cuba and its socialist system depends on whom you ask. Héctor Palacios, a dissident who's been imprisoned twice for speaking out against Fidel Castro, believes that without the charismatic Cuban leader at the helm, the Communist Party's rule will collapse.
It's undeniable that if there hasn't been a strong social backlash in Cuba, if there hasn't been an outbreak of violence until now, it's due to the personality of Fidel. To deny this is to deny history. Without him, it is impossible to maintain the current political system.
But for the current Cuban leadership, the notion that Fidel Castro's death will change everything is absurd.
That is based on the assumption that you have here just a trouble with one man. This is not a personal affair. It is not a personal matter. It's a social phenomenon. It's a social process that involves millions of Cubans and not just one man.
According to the Constitution, the man in line to replace President Castro is the first vice president, none other than his brother, Raúl Castro, currently Minister of Defense. But he's only a few years younger than Fidel Castro. And some analysts believe a longer-term top leadership, whether individual or collective, would be made up of younger cadres. Among them, Ricardo Alarcón, the president of the parliament and a close advisor to Fidel Castro, especially on U.S.-Cuban relations. Carlos Laje, the man credited with introducing many of the country's economic reforms. And Roberto Robaina, formerly the president of the Communist Youth Organization and currently Cuba's high-profile foreign minister. Most ordinary Cubans say they aren't really sure exactly what will happen once Fidel Castro is gone. But most believe that, like China without Mao, things will change. For some, not enough. For others, too much. Lucia Newman, CNN, Havana.
A final word before we go, appropriately enough, from Fidel Castro about change. Long before his revolution succeeded, he was arrested and tried for the campaign to overthrow the government. His words to the court resonated then in 1953, and they do so today.
Condemn me, he said. It does not matter. History will absolve me. Fidel Castro fought a revolution and triumphed. He makes no apologies. And the rest of the world, the rest of his country, has changed much more than he has.
With that thought, we end our look at Castro's Cuba. The revolution turns 40. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jonathan Mann.
I'm Joey Chen. Stay tuned. The Moneyline News Hour is just ahead.